Hello and welcome to this panel discussion today where we're going to go through some of the main outcomes and changes to our safeguard mechanism policy and what it means for Australia and what it means for both the market in Australia for carbon, emissions reduction pathways and supply of carbon and price signals. We're joined by a panel today of decades worth of experience in environmental markets. To my right is Nicole. She's the principal and policy lead of the carbon markets team at Aurecon. Experience is spanning the sustainability, carbon and energy sectors, the majority of which has been in the policy and regulatory roles for the Commonwealth Government. And Heather, who many of you will know, is Aurecon's carbon market integrity lead and in charge of technical due diligence and project assessments. And is also the co-chair of the Carbon Market Institute's Integrity Task Force. And I have Taira, who is an associate at Aurecon and leads its safeguard in ENGA areas and has worked in climate change and carbon for over 14 years and understands the absolute intricacies of the most complicated ENGA's policies that we have. I think we're here now to talk about where Australia's carbon policy is at, because we have had passing of the safeguard mechanism bill through the Parliament last week, which is a great moment in time. Australia can now hold its head up in the UN negotiations as actually having a carbon policy that will be effective. And I think this policy, whilst it was simple in its design, has had some minor changes to it to give it some more strength, but has come through fairly efficient and effective without too many policy changes that might limit its efficiency or even create some kind of market disruptions. We can see just at the time of filming in the last week since the policy has been announced that the market has risen firmly, but not rallied too far nor dropped, and that's a good sign that the market has seen what it was expecting, and that there's nothing in there to push the market down through fear of regulatory change, but also nothing in there that is really going to create a massive push in carbon markets in the short to medium term. And I'm really positive about this scheme. I think it's a simple scheme, which will be an effective platform for future changes and future increases in ambition, if required, but also has the tweaks to allow the supporting policies to support the industry as they transition to a lower emissions economy. We'll start now with a few questions to the panel. To Nicole, what do you think the safeguard mechanism is going to achieve?
Thanks, Raph. I think, importantly, it's going to contribute to our 2030 target, which is 43% emission reductions to 2030, and continue to support facilities to reduce emissions, ultimately getting to our 2050 net zero target. It really gives facilities in the safeguard mechanism a clear remit to implement those emission reductions, look at what the most efficient decarbonisation strategy is and move forward with it. So that will be in the short, medium and long term, depending on the facility, depending on the sector. Facilities we know are looking at what their options are, and they will absolutely use this policy to deliver the most efficient outcome. Decarbonisation is not an immediate fix, but particularly in hard to abate sectors, we'll need to make sure that the safeguard mechanism credits, the multi-year monitoring periods and the offsets that are part of the safeguard mechanism are used to support that transition.
Yeah, it really is important to know that the overall reduction in emissions each year is material, and it will drive decarbonisation strategies. We haven't come across any clients or participants on the emissions side of the industry who aren't doing something and aren't planning for their emissions, their decarbonisation strategy. So this policy, with its set targets, I think it's going to be quite effective. Heather, you've done a lot of work in the integrity space, having worked at the regulator on the implementation and management of the human-induced regeneration method, for example, and other natural vegetation methodologies. What do you think are some of the most interesting points about how offsets are actually used under the safeguard mechanism?
offsets is an interesting thing because at the moment, if you're talking about offsets, you're also talking about integrity. You can't separate those two topics. And at the end of the day, what we've really seen is that public citizens are wanting to be able to trust the schemes that are being put in place by the government that are bringing about emissions reduction and relating to climate change action. So there are a couple of things that have come out in the Safeguard legislative changes or passing that I find super interesting to do with offsets. One of them is around the government being able to prescribe what units are used. So often in a compliance market, you might get a fear that you're just going to be driven by lowest cost abatement. There's not going to be any veracity put into where those units have come from, how genuine and what level of integrity they have. So the government kind of setting up the stage to be able to control what units will and will not be able to be used is kind of saying that we're going to set a bar and then we might adjust that if unit integrity comes into question over time. The second thing I find quite interesting is that your facilities will be allowed to use quite large portions of offsets for their emissions, but anything above 30% they're going to have to explain why. So there is a bit of a control on, we're not just going to let you use offsets forever. You need to actually be looking at your decarbonisation. You need to be looking at your pathway. Yes, offsets, you need them at the moment, but how their emissions profiles change with time and how much offsets they're using, that's all going to be public knowledge and people are going to be able to look at it and understand what different facilities are doing. So I think that's another really interesting change in how the carbon market is setting up that we're seeing.
Yeah, and that was in response to a lot of the policy debate in Parliament around whether companies should be allowed to use offsets and if using offsets is going to delay action. Again, we sort of reiterate that what we see in the industry is an absolute move towards decarbonisation. There's not many signs of delay, and so the use of offsets for us was what we've seen was never really going to delay implementation. But it is good that the government has some of these triggers to reassess the policy if there are laggards, if I'll use that word. So thanks for that. And Taira, just moving to you, what do you know the detail really well, and often I know when you see a policy come out and we all chatter about the joy of the policy and how exciting it is, you're the first person to go, well, I'm missing a little bit of detail here, and until we know this, we're not really sure how it's going to work. So what do you think remains unknown, and what do we need to still understand about how the reforms will work?
Yeah, thanks, Rap. So I'd say, at least to start with, I'd say that we do actually have a lot of detail. The government has been consulting on this for a year and they've been moving towards this final design. So I think, since October last year when the first piece of consultation came up from the department, we've seen more and more detail, and then the bill, in its form that has passed is very close to the form that was introduced. So I'd say that people have a good idea of what to expect. A number of the finer details of the way the scheme is going to work is in the Safeguard rule, as we know. And the department has also consulted on the rule in January this year. So we've seen, very excitedly, we were waiting for those design details to come out, and we've seen that, and we know how it's intended to work. So we have a lot of detail. Participants have enough detail to start thinking about how this is going to be applied. I'd say, however, that in sort of, we know from the last week and the negotiations as they've been building up in Parliament between the Greens and the crossbench, that the government has provided certain concessions, I wouldn't say exactly concessions, but certain amendments, I guess, to gain that support from the Greens and the crossbench. And some of those details are going to be in the rule. So some of those, for instance, include, the big announcements in relation to new gas facilities, where the government has said that new gas facilities they'll require that their reservoir emissions are zero. And so it will be interesting to see how this is actually implemented. Are we talking about zero as in zero at site, or are we talking about net zero as in we can expect that there will be emissions associated with those facilities, but that they all have to be 100% offset. So there's that level of detail that, we have clients coming to us and asking us for how that will play out for them. Another piece of the puzzle that's really interesting is how new facilities, like all new facilities, will be treated. So that we've known since January is a bit of an unknown because the government is working on benchmark emissions intensities for these facilities and we haven't seen the details. So it's hard for participants to predict what their sort of compliance obligation will be going into the future. So that's a really interesting piece that still has to come. And finally, I'd like to just touch on one point that hasn't been covered a lot in the media and also in policy circles, which is how will the safeguard mechanism interact with state and territory schemes? So we know from the past that state and territories have been going up, harder on these requirements because they haven't felt that they've got the support federally. But we know that this scheme is now, it's tough. And so how is this really going to play out in terms of the interaction with states and territories? Because different states are doing different things, but we want, of course, participants want a harmonized approach and they want the ton that they abate in the safeguard to be counted as the ton they've abated for the state regulations. So that will be an interesting space to watch as well. And we do have a lot of clients asking us about, what is this going to mean for them on the ground in terms of their actual licensing approvals? So, So those are the things I'd say, some of the big pieces that we're still waiting on.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of other pieces that I see from a market perspective. But following on from that point, it is really important that we get a decision on how voluntary offsets are treated in the national accounts. Historically, if you surrendered an offset for yourself to be 100% carbon neutral as a company, that was in addition to the government's commitment. So you were allowed to be overly ambitious or more ambitious than the government was. And that rule changed more recently. And there's no real certainty on how, or that rule expired, that ruling, and so there's no real certainty on how that's going to work. So if states and territories and corporates want to go above what the national commitments are, it's going to be really important to understand how they nest, because you can't have a situation where everyone's carbon net neutral, nothing counts towards the government, and the government's 400 million tonnes in a hole behind. So it has to nest, of course, so that's really interesting. The other thing that I've found that many people have been asking about is the $75 cap, which is a medium term for the $75 cost containment measure. It's not really a cap. It isn't. A cap is an unlimited supply of ACCUs at a price. This isn't the case. The government has to actually have those ACCUs in its inventory to deliver to you when you come and ask for them at a fixed price of $75. Now, we don't know how the government's going to procure those. At the moment, the only way they can do that is through the carbon abatement contracts, the historic contract that they've had. There's about 110 million ACCUs that they could secure, but they've released those to the market. So no one's really we don't think there's too many people going to be delivering on those contracts at, say, $13 when the carbon price is $39.70 last trade. So how the government is going to procure a portfolio of offsets to then deliver to the emitters who come and ask for them is a challenge, and we'd like to see more detail on that. We'll have more commentary on that exact on that containment measure in follow-up videos. Just going back to Heather, the safeguard changes brought into legislation are changes to the carbon farming initiative as well. And why did we see that happen?
Yeah, I almost missed this. I actually thank Taira for being so on the ball with what was coming out. So I think this is really the story of the carbon evolving, and I think joyfully actually we're seeing it mature and walk a path of continuous improvement and learning from lessons that have happened elsewhere in the market. So these, we saw a lot of changes come through, or a lot of legislation around transparency and the type of information that is going to be public knowledge under the safeguard mechanism. At the same time, we are seeing changes to the carbon farming initiative to bring about more transparency in that supply side. So it's really talking to both the demand side, which is Safeguard, supply side, which is the Carbon Farming Initiative, and the government actually treating the whole market package. So that was really positive to see. Some of the signals that are being sent by this is that transparency is key. People are going to want to be able to test whether facilities, whether projects are genuine, whether facilities are genuinely accounting and offsetting and managing their emissions profiles. And so this level of transparency, I think, is a really good thing. It also still comes with this is a very complex system. So you're still going to have to be a fairly knowledgeable person if you're going to interact with the information that's being presented. You still have to be able to nuance it and understand it within its context. But I think it's a really positive step in the right direction. So some of the things that we're going to see specifically for Safeguard in the transparency side of things is around compliance reporting. So the ACCUs and SMCs that are the volumes that are going to be used are going to be published. So that's a level of transparency that we haven't previously seen in compliance reporting. They're also going to start publishing the performance of auditors. So you're going to be able to test whether the auditor that you're actually engaging has reputation, is going to actually have a good outcome, and Clean Energy Regulator or the government actually will trust what that auditor says. So that's also, I thought, quite an interesting piece that we're going to see in the public domain. And another third one is actually the publication of annual holdings. So actually being able to see who is holding what units and when they're holding them. And that kind of transference then to be able to understand what's being used and surrendered for facilities to meet their baseline requirements.
Okay. We've got two more questions, and I'll go to Taira and then finish with Nick. We work a lot with participants in the market. So what's next? How do participants get ready for implementing their strategy?
Yep. So there's actually less than 90 days till the scheme commences. I had someone last week told me there's less than 100 days. So we're now on the countdown, which means that there isn't much time to get ready. For those that have not got a big picture strategy in place, should be looking for support now to try and work out what their decarbonisation strategy, long-term strategies, short-term, long-term strategy is going to be, and their offsets strategy, procurement, as well as, evaluation, governance schemes around all of that. This is the time to start getting ready for that. For those that already have these strategies, I think we have enough detail now that you can pull that back out of the top shelf and dust it off and make sure that it is actually meeting what the new scheme requirements are. So I think that this is definitely a sort of big picture activity that a lot of corporates should be doing for individual facilities as well as their groups of facilities. At the same time, I think in parallel, obviously, participants need to start understanding what their individual Safeguard facility compliance requirements are going to be for next year. For existing facilities, most of the information is already available, so participants should be able to start to calculate that facility-specific emissions intensity value that they need for that amazing hybrid model that the government has developed. They should be doing that so that they can start to look at what this is going to mean they have enough information to know what their compliance requirements for individual facilities will be for the whole decade, for the rest, out to 2030. So there's no reason to really dilly-dally anymore. Everything is settled. We know we're going ahead with this. So I'd say, those are the kind of things that people should be looking at. There are many organizations similar to Aurecon that are providing this level of service and have the knowledge and details to help participants put these sort of strategies as well as the individual facility details together. We've been approached by multiple participants who are getting ready and want to know. So I would say, yeah, I think just pick up the phone and find someone who can give you the support you need to start getting ready, because your time is running out. Yeah.
I think I'll add to that and say that there are several key things you need to know before you can have a decarbonisation strategy. To me, the primary one is the forward price forecast of carbon credits in Australia. If prices are going down, you don't need to rush. But if prices are rising really quickly, you're going to need to get your skates on, and they are going to rise. We've been producing price forecasts in Australia now since 2018, and we've recently done some analysis out to 2050. So I think it's important to get your hands on good price forecasting analytics, but don't just focus on the ACCU market, but also this new, very much unknown safeguard mechanism compliance unit, which is its own unit and will trade as its own market. So you should reach out to us to find out how you can have a look at those kind of price forecasts and projections just to fit those into your strategy, because it does help with timing your decarbonisation strategy. And Nicole, just last question to you: why is it important that these reforms have passed? In wrapping up, why are we good to be here?
I think there's a whole lot of detail, and we've heard from the panel, but ultimately it provides a framework and expectations and gives all stakeholders certainty of what the facilities covered by the safeguard, those that are emitting over 100,000 tonnes, around 215 of them, what they need to do and how a time frame in which they need to do it. So we have a 2030 target, that's clear. There'll be continuous targets from there. This is really the launching point, as Taira was saying. Start with your decarbonisation strategy, check that it's appropriate, and as we know, there are plenty of facilities looking at the ways that they can decarbonise and then use the other alternatives in their transition to that space. In the recent negotiations, there's been a strengthening of the amount of emission reductions that will be achieved from the safeguard mechanism. There's an emissions cap that's been announced that will be put on both cumulatively and then in 2029, 2030. There's 100 million tonnes cap for that financial year that we'll need to meet. And there's a range of monitoring policies in place for governments and various bodies to make sure that we're on track to achieve those emission reductions from the safeguard sector. So all in all, we've got a policy, it's been here before, the iterations have come through, and we've got a bright future in terms of decarbonisation in the Australian economy.
Yeah, right. Oh, and so in wrapping up, I think my biggest takeaway is listening to this today, starting with Taira, the complexity and detail of things we need to know now, and how that coal and gas industry is going to be affected, and more stringent requirements on them. That's going to be really interesting. Interaction with state bodies, and even things like the EPPCA. So that's going to be interesting to see. And Heather, I think the transparency that you pointed out, the reporting is a really big step forward in integrity. As you say, you followed up from the Chubb review. If you've got the data and you can analyse it, then it's robust, and any criticism then is criticism that's based on fact. And Nicole, you and I have watched this policy for years now, and I think we both agree that the decline rate is going to be a challenge. This is not an easy decline rate emissions reduction across industry, and emissions decarbonisation strategy is going to need to be implemented quickly. So I like you. I think this policy is going to get us it's a starting platform that's going to get us to where we need to be, and it's a simple platform that can be built upon. It's a fascinating time to be in carbon markets. Long awaited. It's a decade since we lost our carbon pricing mechanism. So it's good to have a new one, and reach out if you want to know more about any of the topics discussed today.